This video will be an introduction to decimals where we look at tenths and hundredths. Imagine if we had one square, that is one whole, and if we took that one square and we divided that into 10 equal parts, we would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 equal parts. Each part is called a tenth, and writing it as a fraction is 1 over 10. But if we looked at that in the place value chart, where we know ones, tens, and hundreds, there's nothing there that says tenths. But the tenths column is immediately to the right of the ones place, and between it there is a decimal point. And so therefore the 1 out of 10, or 1/10, is placed here in the tenths column. In the ones column we have a 0 because we have not made it to one whole yet. So we have 1/10 written as 0.1. If we had now two strips, two of the tenths, 1/10 and 1/10, we would write that also in the tenths column as 2 tenths. 0.2 is 2 tenths. If we shade now 5 strips, we can see that that is 5 tenths. And in the place value chart, we would write 5 in the tenths column to give us 0.5. Again, here's one whole, and if we divided that up into 10 equal parts, we would have tenths. The green shaded strips, if we counted them, each one being a tenth, we can see that we have 4 tenths, which is 0.4. 4 tenths. Let's look at another one. Here's one whole. If we divide that into 10 strips, and we count the ones that are shaded, we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 strips are shaded, 7 tenths are shaded. And so in our chart, we put 7 in the tenths column. In the ones column, we have 0. So we have 7 tenths. Let's look at another one. Here's one whole, divided into 10 strips. 2 of them are shaded yellow. 2 of the tenths are shaded yellow, so we have 2 tenths. And in the tenths column, we have 2. That represents 2 tenths. In the ones column, again, there is a 0. We have not arrived yet at one whole. We have 2 tenths. And one more. Here's one whole divided into tenths. If we count the parts that are shaded, we can see that there are 5 tenths. And we write the 5 in the tenths column. Again, the ones has a 0. And so this represents 0.5, or 5 tenths. Now let's see what would happen if we took one whole and we divided it into 100 squares. One of the squares is known as 1/100th. And in the place value chart, we put a 0 in the ones column because we have not arrived at 1 as yet, one whole. We have 1/100th. We learned about tenths just now. The column to the right of the ones place is the tenths column. But we have 1/100th, and so the next column is hundredths, and we write the 1 in the hundredths column. In the tenths column, we put a 0, and so 1 over 100 is known as 0.01 as a decimal. 1/100th is 0.01. Let's look at another one. There are 100 squares here. 4 of them are shaded yellow. Therefore, as a fraction, we know that's 4 out of 100. As a decimal, if we put our place value chart up, we know that we have not reached one whole yet, and so we put 0 in the ones. Our decimal part we represent with tenths and hundredths. We know 4 hundredths means we put a 4 in the hundredths column, and in the tenths column we put a 0. So 0.04 is 4 hundredths. Now let's look at this diagram. If we count all of the yellow boxes, we can see that the first column is almost all shaded except for 1. We know that that entire column has 10 boxes, and so 1 less means that there are 9 yellow squares. That gives us 9 out of 100, or 9 hundredths. Representing that in the place value chart, we write 9 in the hundredths column. 0 is in the tenths column, and 0 is in the ones column to give us 0.09, which means 9 hundredths. Now let's count the yellow squares in this one. We know the first column is 10 squares, and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares in the second column. That gives us 15 hundredths. And because we can only write one digit in each place, we have to write the 5 in 100ths place and the 1 in the 10ths place to make 15. So 0.15, we don't say 0.15, we say each digit one by one. 0.15 is 15 hundredths. Now you try. Count the amount of yellow squares in the diagram. You should see that there are 3 full columns of 10, so 10, 20, 30, and there are 3 individual squares shaded. So that gives us 33 hundredths. In our place value chart, we write the digits 3 and 3 such that 3 is in the hundredths column and 3 is in the tenths column. And we read that as 0.33, which is 33 hundredths. And one more. How many yellow squares are shaded out of 100? Well, we know that there is only one blue square left, so it should be 99 hundredths. And writing that in the place value chart, we write each digit in each place. So 9 in the tenths column, 9 in the hundredths column. We read this as 0.99, which is 99 hundredths. Now what would happen if all of the yellow squares are shaded? Well, how many squares are there? There are 100 out of 100. And so in order to write that in the place value chart, we know 100 over 100 is 1 whole. And so we write a 1 in the ones column, and we put zeros in the tenths and the hundredths column. This can be read as 100 hundredths, but we know that this is 1 whole. Now let's see how tenths and hundredths relate to each other. In this diagram, we have 10 equal parts. 1 is shaded pink, so we know that that is 1/10. In the place value chart, we would write the 1 in the tenths column, and so 1/10 is 0.1. Now let's look at this diagram, which has 100 squares, and the entire first column is shaded. We know that there are 10 squares in that first column, and so this is 10 hundredths. If we write that in the place value chart, we write 0.10, 10 hundredths. And if you look at both diagrams, you can see that the first column in both is shaded. They represent the same amount of space. And so therefore, 1/10 is the same value as 10 hundredths. Let's look at another diagram that has 10 strips and 2 of them are shaded blue. We know that that represents 2 tenths. And in the place value chart, we would write 2 in the tenths column. That's easy. Now let's look at a diagram with 100 squares. The first 2 columns are shaded, and we know each column is 10. So therefore, we have 20 squares, and that makes 20 hundredths. If we wrote 20 hundredths in the place value chart, we know we would write 2 in the tenths column and 0 in the hundredths column. 20 hundredths. You'll notice that the 2 did not change. And if you notice 2 is in the tenths column, we can read that as 0.2 if it was just 0.2. But because we have the digits 2 and 0, that is 20 hundredths. And therefore 2 tenths is the same value as 20 hundredths. And one more, let's look at this diagram that has 10 equal strips, and 3 of them are shaded green. We know that this is 3 out of 10, or 3 tenths. And we represent that in the place value chart with a 3 in the tenths column. 0.3 is 3 tenths. Now this diagram that has 100 squares, we see the first 3 columns are shaded. We know in each column there are 10 squares. And so that is 30 hundredths. To represent that in the place value chart, we write 0.30 because 3 and 0 make 30 hundredths. And therefore we can see that 3 tenths and 30 hundredths are the same value. Now let's try a few by writing the decimal value for the shape that is shown. You'll notice that there are 100 squares, and the ones that are shaded purple, if you count them, you will see that there are 12 of them. And so we write 1 in the tenths column, 2 in the hundredths column, to give us 12 hundredths. Remember, we can only write 1 digit in each column, and when we have a number that is bigger than 9, we have to write them separately in the tenths column and the hundredths column. This is 12 hundredths. Let's look at this one. This has 10 parts. 8 of them are shaded yellow, and so therefore this is 8 tenths. We put an 8 in the tenths column, and 0.8 is the same as 8 tenths. One more. We have 100 squares, and if you count the ones that are shaded orange, you'll notice 2 full strips of 10, so that's 20, and then almost a full strip except for 2, which gives us 8. So that gives us 28 hundredths. Again, we can only write one digit in each place, and so therefore the 8 is in the hundredths place, the 2 is in the tenths place. That gives us 28 hundredths. 0.28 is 28 hundredths. Here's a diagram with 10 parts. 4 of them are shaded purple, and so we know that's 4 tenths. We put a 4 in the tenths column, and this gives us 0.4 is 4 tenths. To recap, let's look at tenths. If we have 10 strips or 10 parts, and 4 of them are shaded out of the 10, we know we can write this as a fraction as 4 out of 10, or 4 over 10, or 4 tenths. But to write this as a decimal, in our place value chart, we put the 4 in the tenths column, and we put a 0 in the ones column because we have not reached 1 whole yet. And so 4 tenths is 0.4. If we look at hundredths, and we have a diagram with 100 squares, and only 4 of them are shaded green, we can write this as a fraction as 4 over 100, or 4 hundredths. And to write this in our place value chart as a decimal, we locate the hundredths column and we put the 4 there, and we fill the tenths column and the ones column with zeros to hold the place. And this is 4 hundredths, 0.04. And now you've solved the mystery of how to write decimal numbers in tenths and hundredths.